Well, hello, fellow wargamers and history buffs, and I am so pleased this evening to have back on the show my friend Brennan Close, and joining us tonight are two of the famous designers of the Bataille game system, Mr. Dennis Spors and Jim Soto. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and have these gentlemen join me here on screen, and we can say howdy do to everybody here. And we've got about 6 people watching. So if you are watching, please make comments in the comment section. I will read things. This is supposed to be an interactive live stream, so it's not just you listening to us, although I'm sure that will be entertaining. But it's a chance for you to ask questions and make comments and share that with us too. So first off, Brennan, how are you doing this evening?
Well, I'm doing well. We just finished our Austerlitz game, which we sort of squeaked out of with a draw, although it was heading towards a French victory. And the group is gathering soon in Gettysburg for Thomas Fernbacher's second gathering. Could be lots of fun there.
Yeah, we are going to be playing the hypothetical or the alternate history Jena, which was published by Marshal Enterprises, what, about 6 years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago?
Right.
And so we will be playing that with the Regs 30. So that will be a new experience for me because I haven't played Regs in a decade or more. So we'll see how all of that goes. But I'm looking forward to a lot of fun with that. And as well as seeing Ed Wimble and a bunch of other folks I haven't seen in a while, like David Plock and a few others. So it should be a lot of fun, plus meeting some new people. So that's the nice thing about these game conventions, a chance to meet new people and catch up with some of your older friends. Speaking of older friends.
Hey.
Dennis, how are you doing this evening?
Well, I'm doing very well. The weather continues to be less than balmy here in Detroit. It's 30 was a big high today, but things are going pretty well, and things are going well for Marshal Enterprises. We're spending a lot of time play testing and a lot of time exploring some alternatives and so forth to really improve our game that will be coming out in the fall of this year.
And what game is that, just for people who are tuning in?
Okay, it's the Battle of Eckmühl. There's about 3 different ways you can spell that, but if you start with an E and end with an L, you'll be close. But this is it's a very good demonstration of the Austrians taking on the French, and also I've been reading on the various sites that there are people who don't seem to know that there are small games that are included with the large games, that there are small one mappers or half a map game where they can play in quick order, and they can play to begin to understand the tactics and really improve their play. And in this game, I've decided that people really need help with cavalry. So there's a battle where it's really nothing. It's very small. It's very quick. It's at the end of Eckmühl as the Austrian army's retreating towards Regensburg and trying to get over the river. And they throw forward a cavalry screen, and it's met by a couple of cuirassier divisions. So it's basically all cavalry. And I think that'll make a good sense. It's like 6 turns, something like that. It'll be a really good thing that people can play around with heavy and light cavalry and get themselves into the tactics of that.
Sounds excellent. Sounds excellent. And Jim, how are you doing?
Doing very well, and I noticed that Dennis is filming from his casual dining room with the chandeliers, and so I'm very impressed with that. So
Well, this is really our TV room. It's not for formal entertaining. It's it's a little too casual.
There you go. I'm going to have to step up my my setting here. I just have this sort of this office with papers higgly-piggly everywhere. So
I think on those curtains you need to have some kind of gold trim as a good start.
is that it? Okay,
Yeah.
okay. And maybe and so I will have to loot the capitals of Europe, which is I think what you've done to bring all of your artwork there, right? So
Well, we're preservationists. We preserve the artwork of Europe because it could have been destroyed if it wasn't in our possession.
I see. Is that what
We
Marshal Augereau and Massena were saying as they were returning from Italy?
well, when you
well,
go
of
to
course, and
yeah,
Massena came through with his promise because his home is there, and I think it's in Nice,
it's in
and
Nice.
it is really stunning. Even my daughter, who's not much of a Bonapartist, she visited Massena's home, and she couldn't stop talking about all of the wonderful artwork that the Marshal preserved for us.
Well, there you go.
See,
Then, when you recall Massena's role at the incredible center of the cannonade at Wagram, you see he earned it.
yeah,
Yes.
There you go.
And and I remember I was handling Massena's corps in one of the duels in the desert, and I really enjoyed his artillery, his use of artillery. It was quite good. One other thing, Dennis, beside Altgolfsheim, we are going to do we haven't finalized yet how we're going to do it, but we're going to have Ryzen in the package. And Ryzen right now is still up on the website for free as a print and play. But at some point it's going to be taken down, and we're going to have an all new set of counters available in the game, and just some updates to reflect
revamp the map.
time.
Monty's revamping the map. So we'll include that as part of the 1809 package. I mean, that is going on at about the same time these other things are going on. So, and that's another good game for someone to sit down and play solitaire or with a friend to really get into the tactics of the game. It's not too many units. You can keep the turns fairly short and motor your way through to a conclusion. So that's not a huge game. I think it's just one sheet. Is it one or two sheets? I don't remember.
Yeah, it's one sheet, and there's not that many counters, but there's a whole variety of nations that are represented, including there's a Danish battalion, which I think is our only Danish participation in the La Bataille series so far.
I think Amani forced me to do that.
The cavalry action that you mentioned at the close of the Battle of Eckmühl is actually well known as one of the 5 largest cavalry actions in the entire Napoleonic Wars. It's a major draw for historical interest as well as tactical interest in the Eckmühl game. So I'm really looking forward to it. Along with Leibert Volkwitz a few years later at Leipzig, and along with some of the cavalry action around the central redoubt in Borodino, that's a really famous heavy cavalry action.
Yes. So I think people will enjoy it. Both sides are predominantly heavy, but they do have some light cavalry with them. And I'm just working it out now, just starting to do the play testing back and forth. And I think it'll be a good introductory game for people to sit down and really work on the cavalry tactics. There's a few pop guns, but a few horse batteries. But basically, it's all the heavy divisions, and they're going at it. And people can really go through and see how far they can stretch their imagination with the cavalry rules.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've got, it looks like we're averaging around 6, 7 folks tuning in at any given time. But I think if you guys are ready, we can launch into the program and discuss the materials that you guys have put together. Is that agreeable to everybody?
Yes, indeed.
Cool, cool. Here we go.
Do you want to start, Jim?
Yeah, we gave some thought about why we're so in love with the Austrians. Dennis is probably more in love with the Austrians than Monty or myself, but we still enjoy it. And I think a lot of it comes back to the picture that we have right here. This is an inspiration for all of us. There's a woman here who is reading, and it's kind of hard to see, but the picture actually shows her little lapdog that's there. And this is in Vienna at a place called Demels. And it was a very famous, it is a very famous place. It's been open for business, about 10 years 10 years more than, or older than the Battle of Eckmühl. So it's been around, and it kind of set the mood for the Austrian side and what we do. If you could bring it up a little bit more, actually come down to the next picture that we have there, and there we go. So this is an example of the fair that you will find at Demels. And as Dennis likes to say, it's best with a strong cup of coffee.
Yes, it is.
But Dennis, why don't you talk a little bit about what you did at Demels and why it meant a lot to you?
Well, I did live in Austria for 2 years, and it was business related, but you can't do business all the time. But actually, this is connected to business. I lived in Graz, which is in the southeast corner of Austria. But every month we would spend a weekend in Vienna, and it was a little bit of a hike, but no big deal. But the reason that I got into Demels is that we would have meetings in Vienna with various people representing companies like Goodyear and Texaco and people like that. And they'd always want to meet at the Sheraton, in a conference room and so forth. And so quickly, the person I was working with to eventually take over with me, I had to pull him aside and say, we're not here to go to the Sheraton. What we're here to go to, and I said, Demels. He said, Demels? And I said, yes, the place that Mozart got his dessert and coffee. That's where we'll have our meetings. And so over the years, when we had people come from Europe or the United States to sit down and discuss contracts and do things like that, we sat in that very room in Demels, and everybody ordered something, and we tried to keep things civilized. And indeed, there was a lady at the table next to us with a little dog, and that little dog had a pastry too. And so I knew this was the correct atmosphere for me and to conduct these contract negotiations. So I became very fond of this place.
Very cool.
Well, so Dennis had gone there with his wife, where they lived there in the early 90s. But before that, we used to enjoy playing the Austrians. I still remember that prototype copy of Dresden that we put together. Yeah. That all the counters were hand painted, and Dennis took a special delight in hand painting the Austrian counters. I guess he really enjoyed all the white uniforms, and and then the game then gets published by Ed Wimble and folks at Clash at Arms a few years later, after we had kind of semi-retired from wargaming and then came back. So but we're reminded constantly of the Austrians, and the Austrians play a tremendous role in the history of Europe and in the Napoleonic Wars. So, Eric, if you could go back to the top again, I think that's kind of where there we go, right? Yeah, right there. So, so at any rate, Dennis and his wife, Deborah, visited many of the battlefields of Europe, including many that were in Austria or and Dennis, I know you visited Wagram and Aspern-Essling. I don't know if you were able to visit Eckmühl or not.
I drove through there, but I didn't stop. I was going to actually we're going to Alsace to my wife's relatives for Christmas. But I did stop in Aspern-Essling. There really isn't that much to see unless you want to buy a condo on the water. So you know how in the game you've got the bridge and a lot of it is along the Danube, but that it's an excellent place for expensive housing, and most of those areas are taken up by housing. And then you can go from the water and you're basically on a steady climb up to the heights for Wagram that's displayed in that game and so forth. And it's really very featureless. I mean, when I sat down with Monty and talked to him about the map, this was really furrowed ground, and they had used it for parade grounds and military exercises. But it's just a huge flat river plain, and there really wasn't much terrain there at all. Not much of a forest, not much in rocks. I mean, if you had artillery on that hill, you would be able to hit anything. So we did. The other thing that if you're ever in Vienna and you need to walk off some of the cakes here that you've consumed, there's a very excellent military museum for the Austrian Army and something I really hadn't thought about, the Austrian Navy. But they really show a lot of the developments. And they claim that they invented the torpedo. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyhow, there are displays of soldiers and battles and so forth, and they're very proud of the things that they did in 1809, and it showed up in their museum. So if you're ever in Vienna and you have some spare time and need to walk off some calories, you can check it out, and you would thoroughly enjoy it. Particularly, I think we enjoy, as gamers, we enjoy the museums more because we know a lot more about things. When you go to Paris or you go to, you go to Potsdam or someplace, you really know a lot more about it, and it's exciting to see it. Where for other people it would pass over. So I spent 2 years in Austria. I didn't come back to the United States. That was the deal, and I spent my time there. And fortunately, I was able to travel in Slovenia. I was able to travel in Hungary. In the Czech Republic. We were looking for factories because you remember at this time the Russians had just left. Remember the Berlin Wall fell and those kinds of things. Yeah. And so all of their Russian factories throughout those areas had stopped. And I went into some factories and they were in all stages of production on the line, and they had just stopped and the Russians walked away. So we were looking at taking over those factories to make things with. And so fortunately, I was able to go in all of these different countries, and it was just very, very interesting. And the other thing I'll say is that it's interesting that a lot of the entrepreneurs in Austria, the people who have smaller companies that would provide services that we were interested in, they were related to the people that you read about in the books. They got rid of the fun in Austria when it became a republic, but there were a lot of people, and you'd go in their office and they'd have a picture of the Hohendeutschmeister regiment, and I would say something about it, and the person would say, "Oh, well, my great-great-great-grandfather was a colonel in that regiment. How did you recognize it?" So you see all these great things war games did for me. But you meet a lot of people like that have small companies. They're trying to keep their house and their property, their farmland together. And so they become entrepreneurs, and they sell air conditioning units and a lot of things that we would need to keep a facility of that size going. I met a lot of those kinds of people, and they all, they were all very much wanted to keep the properties that they'd had for centuries, and also very proud of the heritage and what their families had done in the Napoleonic Wars.
Very cool.
Yeah.
If we fast forward to the early 2010s, Marshal Enterprises gets back together after being dormant for a few decades, and we started publishing games. And one of our first games, actually, I think it was in our second group of games, was Ryzen. Again, it was 1809. And then we had several 1809 games, which is unusual given what Dennis said earlier about the Austrians and how people tend to be more interested in the Prussians and the Russians and the British and, of course, the French. But we did Ryzen, the Newmark, which was a small game put inside the Aspirin-Essling game. And then, of course, Aspirin-Essling. There's another small game in Aspirin-Essling called the Danube Bridge game, where the French attempt to build a pontoon bridge that the Austrians are trying to destroy by sending burning windmills and.
No, Jim, it's my favorite counter in all of La Bataille. It is the burning sawmill. Floating down the Danube to take out the pontoon bridge. It's the elite. It's better than the old guard, I'm telling you.
And of course, then Wagram. And then in a few months, we've talked a little bit about Eckmühl and Altgofsheim. The Austrians are in Austerlitz and Leipzig, but really 1809 is when they shine, and they have victories at Aspirin-Essling and at Newmarkt, and I think they had one or two other victories. It turns out in the war of the Fifth Coalition, there were something like 32 battles, and almost the overwhelming majority were in Austria or what we would call the Austrian Empire. Now, people need to understand something about Austria, and it's very difficult for we as Americans or Western Europeans with a democratic background, that Austria was not a nation. It was a mishmash of all kinds of different things. It was a sprawling country. So you have Austria, Hungary, Czechia, which is Bohemia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, parts of Poland, Romania, and Italy were the Habsburg lands in 1809. And the Habsburg family had ruled this sprawling mishmash of entities since the 1200s. And but they didn't rule them like a nation. It was very unusual. Some were kingdoms, some were duchies, some were like free towns. They were all kind of connected, and they didn't really have much organization. Well, that's what hurt the Austrian army, is because they realized that, well, there was nothing holding them together. And other than the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs themselves weren't even unified. There was an Italian wing of the Habsburg army, and for some reason, this Italian Habsburg, D'Este, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, he commanded the Habsburg forces in Poland, at Ryzen. So when you take a look at the army that's in Ryzen, it's similar to the other Austrian armies. There's a few Hungarians and some Austrians, some Italians, there's Croatians, all kinds of different people. And you kind of wonder, well, how do these people communicate? Well, they didn't very well, which is why they had a lot of problems. So, any rate, so we're going to talk, well, Archduke Charles is someone who is really underappreciated in history. He fought Napoleon as well as anybody. He was the first person to defeat Napoleon in a large battle. Napoleon was defeated at Acre in Syria during that campaign, nearly 10 years earlier. But Archduke Charles was an aggressive general who had done very well in the Wars of the Revolution, defeated Jourdan and Massena, and really had done a good job. He was the brother of the Emperor Francis, and he had another brother, Louis, who also was a general. But Francis got tired of losing because he had lost basically 3 wars in a row to Napoleon, and was itching to get his revenge and to get back some of those motley territories that the Austrians had accumulated. And so he wanted those back. So he put his brother Charles in charge of the army, and Charles did a lot of things. Now, I'm going to mention some of the higher level things, and then Dennis is going to get into some of the details from a tactical point of view in terms of what he did. And so the first thing is that Charles introduced a general staff to the Austrians. They never had a general staff before, and it showed. And I know that Eric and I have been playtesting Eckmühl, and both of us have played both sides. And one of the things about the Austrians is they have a lot of leader counters with minuses on them, and that's just the way it is. And you got to be very careful how you use your leaders, because it may be worse to use a leader rather than not. But sometimes you have to use them. So Charles did the staffing. Charles also gave the Austrians the idea of a nation in arms, and so they created, he created the Landwehr, which only applied to German-speaking parts of the Austrian Empire. So the Hungarians and some of the other people didn't have a Landwehr, but that increased the size of the army tremendously, and it was important that they had that group of people. And then he also finally switched the Austrians to a corps organization like the French. So if you remember in Austerlitz, in the Austerlitz campaign, the Austrians were just a motley group of people held together not by a whole lot. So this core organization was crucial for the Austrians to be competitive. Dennis, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the important tactical advancements that Charles made.
Well, let me say that from a game designer's standpoint, in many of these battles, the Austrians start out in corps. And then for some reason, which I haven't yet figured out, they take and rearrange the corps, parts of the corps, into columns. So when the French go to attack, they'll say, Massena, here's your objective. And Massena takes his army pretty much, or his corps, and marches to get that. In this battle, they have a corps structure, but then when they want to go on the counterattack, they split up the corps and they move parts of one corps to another corps just before they want to have a major offensive. And I kind of runs counter to everything I know about managing people, is that you don't make a lot of changes in the organization right before you do something major. So that has kind of provided a real challenge for me in doing the designs of these things and the orders of battle, when it's not just as simple to have a leader and a corps go somewhere. And when you get the Eckmühl game, now many times, like for Aspern-Essling, the column and the corps can be the same. But in this Eckmühl game, Charles wrote out all of the orders to go on the offensive, and he took and broke up some of the corps, and he moved things around from one place to another, and he called them columns, and then they went forward. So when you get the game and you're reading through the order of battle, and then you get to what the optional battle is on the second day, you'll say, well, wait a minute, this guy used to be in the second corps, now he's in the third column, and you'll see people move back and forth. So that's just spur of the moment, the way that they did things.
Do you think that had to do with like some sort of aristocratic hierarchy where they're trying to get, some people are trying to get some sort of favoritism, being the leading the attack or something like that? Or what's the thinking behind it?
I don't really understand why you would do that. It would seem like the commanders, you know how it is. We're used to dealing with each other, and you put two new people in and then try to do a game design. It would take you forever to get through those relationships. So I don't quite understand it, why, but I know it presents it presents me with a challenge of trying to rearrange these troops and make sure that they're all there, but they've moved into different organizations. And talk about, if you're looking at commanding people, how difficult that would be. So maybe somebody knows why they did that. As yet, I haven't discovered. Maybe he looked at the troops in one corps and said, well, they're just not adequate for the mission, and he added some people to them. Or he subtracted some people.
Dennis, what sources are you using to explore the reorganization from corps into columns?
I don't have the stuff in front of me, but I use the usual books on the Austrian army, the ones that are probably the most popular. And you start out with their organization, and then you see how it morphs into different things into these battles. So I can't recite which books I'm using. I'm sorry.
One of the criticisms of Charles was that he would write something or tell people or teach an idea, but then when it came to practice, he didn't always follow up. So he had some great ideas in terms of commands and so forth, but he could rarely stick to it. So that's one of the major criticisms of Charles.
Okay, so if we want to look at, I'm just going to give you the Dennis Spors view of what I see in the Austrian army. And, keep your mind open. It may not work this way for you, but this is the way it's worked for me playing the Austrians in many of these games. So if I look at the regular infantry, that's all those guys in white typically. The thing that you'll notice about them is that they have very large battalions. And so, and those provide good firepower and combat in deploying them into 2 hexes, which is what I typically do. They have good morale in line. Their morale isn't quite as good when they're in column. Now you have to remember in La Bataille, a shift of a couple of numbers is very, very significant. Shifting on the die rolls, three numbers has a very big impact. And what I notice in some people working on different things, that they make the changes too profound and not subtle enough. And so you have to be very careful about that. When you roll many times, like we do in these games, as Jim and Eric have said, they're shooting at each other all the time, and the casualties have been heavy and the rolls are many. And so they're rolling a lot over time. 3 increments or 3 3 places on the die, going from 23 to 26 over that many rolls has a big impact, particularly when the leadership you have is leadership in name only. So anyhow, they have large.
Just quantitatively, because it's a 36-point linear system, each point of dice is about 2.5%. So a 3-point shift is about a 7.5%, and a 4-point shift is about 10%. And that's quite noticeable over the duration of the battle.
And in La Bataille, you don't roll just a few times. If you remember your turns, you're rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling. So as we know when we study the mathematics of it, that those, you can get a hot streak and a cold streak, but over time it will even out, and so that's a big deal. So they have large battalions. They have very good firepower. They have good morale when they're in line. And then one of the things that's a little bit unique to them is that they can form into this formation that we have for just the Austrians called battalion mass, which is less risky to get into than square. It's not quite as good as a square, but from their standpoint, I use it a lot because there's a lot less risk for them to try and form a full square. Now, the concerns that you have, one of the things I look at is that there are fewer battalions. So while your numbers may be the same, you actually have fewer battalions. And that's also important in this game where you have, pieces of cardboard and hexagons and so forth. So you have to be careful and keep in the back of your mind not to get these troops demoralized or routed, because when their battalions go, the advantage becomes a disadvantage. You have a lot more people routing away. And then out of line in column or routing, as I said, the morale is below what we would consider to be, or worse than what we consider to be the average. And so there's a higher normal chance that they will not stand or not recover their morale. So what they tend to be is really good troops at the beginning. And then as they get worn down by casualties, they're pretty good. And once they break, they're much harder to get them to recall. And when they break, they take a lot more people with them in routing. So when we've talked about how La Bataille is a numbers game and an attrition game. And so that's a lot of people that are taking off. Now for the Grenadiers, and then I'll explain why these things are important later on. For the Grenadiers, they're pretty good size. They have good firepower. They have good melee values. They have good morale values, and they're solid troops. But they're as close as you can get to a guard. The negative part of it, as I see it, is they've been taken away from the regiments. And I think if I was playing this and organizing it, I would prefer to have the Grenadiers with the regiments. That's probably pretty revolutionary for a lot of people. But I think that I would rather have them with the regiment than concentrated into its own little operation. And so the potential concerns, as I say, removing it from the infantry regiments, think of how much stronger they'd be with that, often not committed in force. And that's one of the rules that I was speaking with Eric about in how the things are committed. And we've come up with rules about how these troops get committed, where they come in, when they come in, and so forth. So it's really a mystery about, somebody's showing up. You may not know what, you may not know exactly where, and you may not know how many of them are going to show up. And that means both the French and the Austrians. And so I think that replicates a little something for them.
Yeah, we certainly found
you like that part of it.
We did. We because with a lot of the games, that, okay, at this point in time, these guys are marching on and this is where they're marching on. And so therefore both players can anticipate that. In this case, we knew somebody was showing up at, the 4:00 turn. We just didn't know where on the map they were going to show up. And we didn't know in what strength they were going to show up. So it certainly made it the French couldn't discount it and ignore it, and the Austrians couldn't count on it to save their bacon because you had no idea what you were going to get. I think we had one situation where out of potentially 6 units that could have marched on, only 1 battalion marched on. So like, oh, I guess my offensive is going to have to slow down a little bit. This 1 battalion is not going to tip the scale. So, but
And
yeah, it was just bad rolls sometimes.
Well, yeah, and the idea came from that. As you read these histories, Charles could make up these plans, elaborate plans, but he wasn't really guaranteed that people would show up on the anointed time. And how many of these battles have we seen where Napoleon's kind of even with somebody, but he can count on the fact that Ney is going to show up at a certain time, or someone else shows up at a certain time, or when they don't, he loses big time. But they have the staff, and they have the orders going around, and it's relatively clear what you're supposed to do. When you read these histories for the Austrians, that really isn't the case. It's not the case in 1805, and it's certainly not the case in 1809. They have troops roaming around on the north side of the Danube while this battle's going on, and so you don't know exactly what's going to come on. So that's just a little wrinkle that we put in. Then if you move on to the Jägers and Grenztruppen, their strengths, as I see it, their fire values are very good. They're all, certainly all the Jägers they're all people from, that handled pheasantries and handled lands, noble lands, and so forth. And they were excellent marksmen. They had rifles and whatnot. And they had the ability to skirmish, and they work well in terrain. What I see is their potential concern. They're very few in number. It's not like the French have for every brigade, there's a regiment of light troops or something like that. So they're few in number. Their melee values are somewhat below the mean. That's not really their thing. And they're scattered throughout the army. So if you have a corps, you might have 1 or 2 of these maximum. But if you can keep them in terrain and keep them firing where they're not going to take a lot of casualties, they can really. Have you found that in attacking you guys in Eckmühl, trying to get through the forest to get through the French lines, have these troops been a problem?
Yes, very definitely so. They're also real tough when you put a Jaeger or a Grenz unit in a town. It's very hard to wedge them out.
So that's the places so using them in the open would not be something I would want to do. Now the artillery, I mean, some of the things are, I don't know, they don't fire much, but individually there are some artillery units that have pretty good fire values. There are a lot of them, like their cavalry batteries, that you wonder why they made them. But many of these weapons are not organized to put 2 or 3 in a hex and put them together and create a grand battery. Many of them are to support the infantry in more of a direct fashion. So even the little pop gun things that they may not, brigade batteries and so forth, but if you put them with the line, if you put 2 battalions and you put those in line, and then in one of the hexes you have one of these guns, it provides you with a very effective fire. You're not going to move very far, but it provides you with a very effective fire. So my suggestion here is not to try to create the kinds of reserves that you would see for the Russians, or the long range firing and so forth that you would see with the French or you would see with the Russians. Try to use them a little bit more as in supporting the infantry directly. And then if I look at the cavalry is generally very good. They have particularly I like big hussar units. They can't be big enough for me. I would want 30-step hussar units. They're just They're my Panzer divisions, you know, they just roll. But and their heavy cavalry is very good, you know, as on a one-on-one basis. But then when you look at, you take the percentages, which I always do when I sit down to do these battles. I work mathematical percentages for all the sides, and I see what they have by percent, and I know what a mean is for the French, and so I compare this stuff. And so they have very, very there's a very low percentage of cavalry in comparison to the whole army. So there's not that much of a reserve. There's the 2 Cuirassier divisions, but that's less than the French have. There's no real light reserve, but what tends to happen is you might have a hussar or a Chevaljäger with each one of these corps, maybe 1 or 2 in their advanced guard. They're excellent units one-on-one, but they don't really have the numbers to go at it. And that's one of the interesting things about this cavalry battle. They do have heavy and they do have light. Alta Glofsheim, they do have enough to go at it, but they're in numbers, but they're much bigger regiments, and the French will have 2 regiments for every one of theirs, but they'll be equal in value. And so that's one of the things that I'm working on for that game. Now, if you look at leadership, you notice I didn't list an advantage. I just went right away to potential concerns. So very few leaders with an above average ability, thus they have a limited impact on the battlefield. And the rules are written to cast doubt regarding the exact entry point numbers, reinforcements, to simulate their mediocre staff work. So what I tend to use, I try to find some that, boy, it's really hard to find Austrian leaders that convey much in this case of morale. It's set up that, you know, this is kind of a feudal army and the troops aren't, they're lucky if the troops don't kill the leaders. So you have to really search around, and somebody may have a negative but a positive for something else, but you're not going to really get too much advantage from that. Thus, you know, when you play the French and a good battalion or 2 break, you can get one of these all-world leaders, all-star leaders back there, and you have a good chance to recover. When the Austrians start to go, you know, you're only getting a 1 or 2, if you're lucky, a 1 or 2 advantage. So when they go, it's real hard to get them back with the leaders. So unlike the French, don't really count on the leaders making a huge difference for you. They're not going to save you.
Now, one leader that is good for the Austrians is Charles. Charles is a very good leader, and it seems counterindicated, but I know that in Aspern-Essling, he actually leads an assault to, I think, take the church or the they have the grain mill
Granary.
there.
The granary.
Yeah, he leads the assault, and he's leading a couple of battalions. But that's the only person who could do it, and he had to do it. So, which is, you know, he could be subject to getting knocked out of action very easily if you're not careful.
The other one that's pretty good is Hiller, and he's in the Neumarkt game, and he's in the Aspern-Essling game. But after Aspern-Essling, I guess he quit and he left. And so somebody else took over his corps, and that's kind of it for that guy. But he did a good job at Neumarkt. He did an okay job. He gets defeated before this battle, as you know, the French are pushing back the Austrians out of Bavaria. So I kind of like Hiller's attitude. But anyhow, it's really Charles, and if you're going to throw Charles in the line a lot, you know, you could be putting a lot at risk. So this is my perspective, and this is the way I have gone at people. One of the best Austrian games that I played was what's the town at Leipzig where the French hold the bridge? You know the one I'm
Lindenau.
Lindenau. I think
Yeah.
it's Lindenau, yeah. And to try to use the Austrians to force your way across the bridge against the French, and they're going to use that eventually to escape. And I think it's Bertrand that defends
Yeah,
there.
Bertrand, yeah.
And I had a great knockdown, drag out battle with somebody as the Austrians and trying to get across the bridge. And I could use my firepower to get up to their reinforced positions and I could get them to break. But then as soon as I went into column to try to pursue things, I got chewed up. And so, but it was a great experience that in the open, they were pretty good. But then when you tried to do any kind of pursuit or any kind of movement, then it was not a good situation. And so I remember I had a whole regiment of Hungarians that had to surrender and after they captured a redoubt. But anyhow, that was for the Leipzig game. So those are some of the things that these are just some of my suggestions that you try out. Now, anything I say, I have all the disclaimers like the medicines do on cable television, that, don't take it if you're allergic to it and all that kind of stuff. But I think if you try some of these things, I'm not asking you to play like I play, but if you try some of these things, they may help aspects of what you're doing now. Or you say, well, I never really looked at it that way. I'll try that. I always encourage people to try these things core on core, just play amongst your, just solitaire kind of things to see how they figure out. So the Austrians are the most vulnerable when they're on the move, as we said, especially approaching the enemy. That's where you got to be really careful about getting clipped and attacked before you can deploy. You do not want to get attacked while you're still in column and trying to move up. So you want to deploy a distance from people and slowly edge your way up. I know that's it takes a lot of turns to do that, but if you just march up in column, the French will just jump on you and beat you back. That's so. And I think you should explore the use of light cavalry in their skirmishing formation because that slows down the enemy moving forward. They have a zone that projects out, and they're basically skirmishing. So that slows down from Kitchener. Well, I'm in Detroit, William. So holler at me across the river. It's basically 1 mile from my house. But anyhow, if you have the light cavalry out there and they're in skirmish order, you can slow down the approach of an enemy infantry, and that might give you the difference to then deploy and then pull that cavalry back. So you should explore those tirailleurs à cheval, excuse my brutal French, but explore those rules because they can be very, very helpful when you have such large hussar units. And then in close combat, use some of the artillery in the infantry line to try to add some firepower. I am not a big fan of meleeing with the Austrian infantry. I try to reduce the enemy by firepower and then and try to get them to break because I just, in my opinion, they're not really good in melee. They can be good individually, but in moving forward, it's kind of iffy. I don't like that. Don't initiate cavalry battles, especially with reserves. Try to use these to do limited counterattacks and use them to defend your infantry, but be careful about trying to jump Napoleon's reserve with your cuirassiers. That's probably, you're going to be, because you don't have to take many losses as the Austrian cavalry to all of a sudden you don't have that cavalry arm to protect you. And that makes a huge difference in this game. One of my favorite things that I love to do is play somebody and I'll trade my infantry for their cavalry. And when they don't have any cavalry anymore and I have a lot of cavalry, that's when I enjoy the game the most. The infantry to me, it's kind of like the salad. I just want to get through it. But I enjoy. So remember, these guys can bail. The cavalry can bail you out. They can protect you. So be careful about using them as an offensive weapon. And watch your infantry losses and be prepared to rotate fresh battalions and fall back and regroup. These aren't troops that you can have stand there and just ground down to nothing. or once they get to 50% and they're routing, it'll be very, very difficult to get them back. Back up the line. You have a line, but don't have 2 or 3 lines deep. My advice: try to back up your line with things that you'll have some defense in depth, because with the chances and the dice, the odds are somebody's going to break, and you don't want to just be, you don't want to have an open hole like that in just lines. That's very dangerous. So have some people in the background, some infantry in the background, with maybe in battalion mass is what I like to do. I'm not moving them. I'm just keeping them as a reserve in case the worst happens. I can kind of pin other people till I can bail myself out. Deploy all the battalions. I tend to deploy the battalions of a regiment in the same formation, and I fight regiment by regiment. And there was a rule like that, and I think it really works best. Use the limited number, Jim hit on this, using the limited number of light troops that you have in woods or towns. Don't get them in the open. They can be really strong. And I think we played a game where somebody deployed, and I was in a swamp with the Jaeger unit, and they deployed, and they were standing next to the swamp. They couldn't come into the swamp, but the Jaeger could fire the extra hexes, and so I could just sit there and pick the guy off, but he couldn't get at me. And remember the math of the game over time. It's not necessarily what you do at the beginning that's the greatest impact, but about 3/4 of the way through these games is when the telling things happen. The Austrian army is strong, but it's brittle, and try to avoid the exchange battles, because in a morale battle, in a battle to where the morale makes the difference, the Austrians, once they go to line and once they get to 50% losses, they're really going to be, and the bad leadership or the less than stellar leadership, it's going to be very hard to recover them. So what I found in playing them is once they're gone, they tend to just hit the road, and you don't get them back. So those are some of the ways that I go about playing the Austrian army. Even in miniatures, I got in a miniatures game once, and I don't know anything about miniatures, but I got in a game one time where Monty wrote me he needed somebody to play the Austrian. So I played, and this is all that I did. And the French player said, "Well, when are you going to melee?" And I said, "Well, I'm not meleeing, man. I'm here, and you have to go through me to get to these guys. So here I am, and you can't go around me, and I'm not attacking. I'm just going to keep firing and firing and firing, and and you'll have to just take me all out." So this is if we take a look at, if you scroll down a little bit, Eric.
Okay.
Just scroll down a tad.
That is as far as it'll go for me.
No, go up. I mean, as far as I want the map above.
Ah, there we go.
So it's a little bit hard to see, but we'll post this on our website. This is a historical map of the Battle of Eckmühl, and you can see that Davout is at the top of the French formation, and they're on the western part of it, and then Lefebvre with a lot of the German troops, and they form a line. And then the Austrians have a line matching them, and then they have a weak line along the river, and all those little rectangles that are approaching, that's all Napoleon's reserves. It's Lannes, it's the cuirassiers, it's etc. So that's what makes the scenario 2 pretty tricky for the Austrians, is they have to kind of fight a rear guard action, or they would get plowed over. And then this next photo or next picture, if we scroll down,
Sure.
I guess, yeah. This is one of the key battles, is that this is the town of Eckmühl, and you had, I think it's the Deutsche Banat unit, the Romanians, and they hold the town. And then the King's Jaeger unit, are they Württembergers, Jim?
The King of Württemberg.
The King, the König Jaegers, they're Württembergers, aren't they?
Württembergers,
Yeah.
Yeah. And they assault the town, and Napoleon directs them, and they had to assault it 3 times before they ejected him out of the town. So it's kind of a key point to be able to break that line and the French to get across.
Now, just a little aside here, Napoleon loved the Württembergers, and the Württembergers were probably the most loyal German troops that Napoleon had, and they served him until after Leipzig. Right after Leipzig, they defected. But one thing is that we show in the game is that Napoleon had an escort, and it was the Württemberg, not the Hussars, but the Württemberg Chevalier troops, and he trusted them so much with what they could do for him, and so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, his guard. There's no French guard in this game. They're a ways away. So he took and got this German cavalry unit to be his guard.
Hey, we've got a couple of questions. So first off, Perry has a question. Forgive the dumb question, but does Battalion Mass have unique melee capabilities?
I don't have this in the back of my head, but they. I mean, I don't have all the answers just right in that. What it basically does is the Battalion Mass is not as vulnerable as the square is to artillery fire. I think it's a 5, and the square is a 4. The other thing is when you're attacked by cavalry, there's a substantial advantage to the Battalion Mass. It's not quite as good as the square, but it's much better than a column, and it's something you don't have to roll to put yourself into. You can. I've forgotten, and I apologize, all of the rules that have to do with it. It's really a lightweight square if you think about it that way. It can fire, and it moves better than a square. It doesn't quite have the. It has better fire defense than a square, but it. What do I want to say? And you don't. It's not one of those things you have to roll to form, so it's not as risky. So you gives you some protection against cavalry, but yet they can still move around a lot more than a square can.
All right, we've got another question here from Horsa 2100. Will there be anything retroactive for Wagram and Aspirin Essling, or is there no change of relevance?
No. Go ahead, Jim.
I assume that Horsa 2100 is asking whether there are going to be any changes to Wagram and Aspirin Essling due to anything we might have done in Eckmühl. But I think the rules for Wagram and Aspirin Essling are the special rules are virtually identical to Eckmühl. There's nothing substantially different.
Yeah, the only thing that I've noticed that's different is the printed morale value of the Austrians is better than it is at Wagram and Aspirin Essling. But otherwise, the other special rules for deploying in line and everything else seem to be almost identical.
Now, I know that we have talked about some of these morale values and fire values and so forth. So there will be some difference from what the playtest counters have and what the actual for sale counters are going to have. So they're a little bit, we've made some adjustments. Ryzen, for example, the counters will now reflect the values that you see in Eckmühl, Wagram, and Aspirin Essling.
So it'll all be it's all coordinated.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully that was we answered the right question that he was angling for there. We've got another one here from William. Does the weakness of the Austrian army in the games in the Napoleonic era, I don't know. William, are you trying to say reflect something? Does the weakness reflect it? Or it looks like you didn't quite finish your question. So So the question is, gentlemen, does the weakness of the Austrian army, is that reflected in Napoleonic era games?
Well, as always, I only speak to what we design. Okay, and that's probably a good politically correct way to do it. But I think that what I've just pointed out to you is there are weaknesses, but there are also strengths. And what you have to do is you have to take your French chapeau off and you have to put on your Austrian hoot, and you have to think like they do and operate your army and understand that it's not the dynamic vehicle that the French have, but you can still do very well with it. I had Ed and I have had some good games, and we played Dresden, and I had the Austrians, and he threw divisions of the Young Guard at me, at my corps, and he ground down a corps. It was backed up by another one, but he ground down a corps. It took him hours and hours and hours, and he lost a lot of people, and I lost a lot of people. But I adhered to basically what I'm telling you right here. And then only at the end, when there was weakness, did I throw the big boys against the Young Guard, Chasseurs à Cheval, and got him to rout. But we spent hours just pounding away with artillery, and he just couldn't quite get me. He ground me down. I think in 5 or 6 hours, he took 4 or 5 hexes forward. And it was just, a game of attrition. And I knew that. And so I had a fresh corps behind it. And he had to grind me down to get through. I wasn't going to do any melees where I got thrown back, any of that stuff. So my answer to that is play to the strengths of each, decide what the strengths are of each of these armies and play to those strengths. To do well with the Austrian, you have to become the Austrian.
Yes, Sensei Dennis. Very well said. All right, it looks like William has clarified a question. He says, so does the weakness of the Austrian army in any way reflect the increasing weakness of the empire throughout the 19th century until its dissolution after World War I?
Well, I think
this is more of a meta question, maybe.
Yeah, the Austrians, their weaknesses because of the problem that they're not really a nation, that they're so diverse. There's no unity. It's not a national army, and I think those are the things that continued to accelerate throughout the 19th century and then into the early 20th century. Now, you could easily argue that the Austrians were the real winners of the Napoleonic Wars because Metternich got all that he wanted at the Treaty of Versailles, where they had a couple of different peace conferences.
Congress of Vienna.
Austrians were, and the Austrians,
there were several.
Yeah, and the Austrians basically, their position was the position that prevailed, and only over the years, as William I think can probably agree, that they did get weaker, but their position, they went from strong in 1815, and then they started to decay. And by 1848, they also decayed demographically. They weren't the same as the Prussians and later the Germans, that were just a demographic powerhouse. So there's a lot of different reasons for all of this occurring, but definitely the Austrians of 1815 were a lot stronger than the Austrians of 1915. No question about it.
Also, if you look at the La Bataille games, specifically from 1809, Aspern-Essling and Wagram and Eckmühl, to 1813, you actually can see some of the trend that William is talking about in the armies. In 1809, the Austrian army that went on the offensive was the peak that they could manage with Charles's reforms. And it had lots of excellent infantry regiments, and it had a robust, well-equipped cavalry with it.
Yes.
And they tried as hard as they could. They actually defeated Napoleon at Aspern-Essling in the open field. So they managed to. And Wagram was this colossal, struggle where they almost pulled off at least a draw. So in 1809, they were at the peak. And then by 1813, although Napoleon was reeling back from Russia and the Prussians had switched sides and the Russians were pouring in, the Austrians were kind of hesitant to actually join the 1813 liberation campaign because they were concerned with their economic weakness. Yes. And then in 1813, if you look at the Dresden army of the Austrians, it's actually a step down from the 1809 Austrians in its equipment. There's a lot less cavalry. And if you read some of the history there, you can hear Emperor Francis telling Schwarzenberg, this is the only army you're going to get in 1813. We can't back it up. So don't be aggressive with it. So use it in the Anaconda plan that they had, to squeeze Napoleon. But don't press forward the way we did in 1809. And it shows up to a degree at the tactical level in the London.
Excellent point, Brennan. Excellent. All right, we've got another comment here. It says, Horsa, I wanted to thank them for adding Rise into the game package. So that should be nice to have that where you can get a nice printed copy.
Yeah, it's we started our journey back, from from Elba? Is that where we were, Jim? And we landed again, and we started producing games. And what our first thought is that we wanted to give people free games but they have to put in their first grade skills and assemble them. But we wanted to do that. It was good for us to get our head back into creating a game, and it was good for people that out of the chute or come out of the whatever you call it, coming back, and we were producing things. Why would anybody believe that we would do a good job? Well, I'll give you a free game and let you play it, and then you can see if we still can produce quality materials. So we continued to put these free games on our website. They don't take that. You have to get some sharp scissors and a few materials, but you can put them together and play with those games. And then we figure when they've been on the site long enough and we're creating something that's within the same time frame, we'll take that small game and include it with this bigger monster game, again, to take and help people out that they can buy the big game, but they know, well, I want to see how the Austrians work. I want to see how their cavalry works. I want to see this or that. Then they can play a much smaller version, even against themselves. I mean, if you play against yourself, you never lose. But if you play against yourself and so forth and see how things work and so forth before you go to conventions or tournaments and whatnot, then I think that's a great way. So virtually in all of our games, there are either very small scenarios or there are small games unto themselves. And that's really where people should start before they launch. I know it's cool to set it all up and take up the dining room table through the holidays, but if you get one of the small games and set it up and then play that several times from both sides, that's a serious education. And so that's what I think everybody should be doing to improve.
Cool. Let's see. Oh, here we've got a comment. When I play against myself, my opponent cheats. Yeah, I've done that a few times. Like, oh, this is not a good roll. Let me roll again. See if I can get a better roll.
I think that dice was tilted a little bit. It has
exactly.
a nick in it.
Yeah. Something's not quite right there.
Well, I wanted to thank Jim and Dennis and the Marshal team, and also Ed with Dresden for bringing the Austrians really into the La Bataille world. As a person who's interested in history and also in games of different levels, first of all, you read about the Napoleonic period and you do come to realize what Jim was saying, which is that the Austrian Empire and its struggle against France was a huge part of the Napoleonic Wars. okay, so what did that mean? And then if you play the operational level games, like there's one Napoleon at Leipzig, which is a brigade and divisional level game, and there's another classic, which is absolutely fascinating, which is the Struggle of Nations, which is a quite detailed operational level game. The Austrian army there plays a huge role, but it's done at a level above the La Bataille system. And so you see their quantitative presence, but you don't actually understand what that was like tactically. And by actually doing all these really interesting and detailed treatments of the major Austrian battles and the Austrian forces, then for the learner who's trying to figure out the history and get the texture of it, it's La Bataille which can really show you what that was like tactically. And then as a game player, the very interesting thing is exactly what you said before, Dennis, which is that, okay, yeah, now the games provided by Marshal and Clash of Arms are showing the Austrians in tactical and mechanical detail, and they are very, very different, authentically different from the French. And then, as a gamer and interested in the logic of it, the question is, how do you use this army? And you have to change your approach to playing the game to really fight like the Austrians and operate it like they operated historically. So it's a really very interesting set of games through all the Austrian games that you've
Oh, thank you.
All right, we've got, if there's any other questions out there, go ahead and post them now, folks. We're going to wrap things up here shortly. Horsa, again, is asking, will there be smaller scenarios to accommodate those who have limited space and time?
So this particular package will have two games, two small games. It'll have Ryzen, which we talked about, and also have the cavalry Altgofsheim. I think I hope I'm
pretty close, Jim. Alta Glofsheim. You're getting closer. You're getting closer.
And so it will be an opportunity for people to play that. We were talking about the map recently on Altgofsheim, and it is going to be nice and small. You'll be able to set it up, and you should be able to play it in an afternoon. Or
I think it's 6 turns. It's really, because it's at dusk. It goes like dusk into night, and so at some point you just become ineffective. So it's just a few turns, and you're going to be able to charge a couple times and rest a couple times, and then you're going to be close to the end of the game.
There is also a scenario that we had play tested, scenario 1 of Egmont, which is just on one half of the map. So that would be one for it's a decent sized battle because you've got basically 2 corps on the French side, but it doesn't take up a huge section of your table. You might be able to set that up. But it will take a fair amount of time to play through. But that's a good.
We actually at Consim in Tempe this past August, we got 3 games of scenario 1 in, and they were pretty easy because there's a kind of a rhythm that goes with that game, and so it seems to move along a little bit faster. The other scenarios have more intricate interplay that goes on, which makes it a little more difficult to have a quick game.
Good. And Perry has a question here. Will Egmont go on pre-order, and when?
We will put it on sale in August, and I think we're having discussions about exactly when the game is going to be put together. A publication date, it's either going to be late September or early October. And we'll look at everybody's calendar. But yeah, we'll start selling it first part of August, middle of August. And that's what we do traditionally. It goes on sale anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks before we actually send it out.
Cool. And I would recommend everybody that there's a couple of great La Bataille support websites. So Marshal Enterprise has a website, labataille.me, where you can find out information about their games, both past and present. There's also some very interesting articles that both Jim and Dennis and Monty have written, some of them explicitly touching on the Austrian army in 1813 and the Austrian cavalry, etc. So you can go there and find additional resources for that. The other thing that you might do is, if you are on Facebook, there is a La Bataille series Facebook page, and you could ask to join that. And just about every week when Jim and I get together to play test Egmul, I am posting pictures and updates of our scenario and what's going on with that. So you can follow it there. And then announcements and other La Bataille questions can be found on the Consim forum page, where you can then ask questions of Ed Wimble's there. And then these gentlemen are here as well to answer questions about stuff, as well as post announcements of upcoming games and release dates. So I think that's about it. Is there anything else that you gentlemen want to add before we kind of wrap things up here?
Well, Jim usually takes care of the Consim site. And I have recently, last 6 months, I've gotten into taking care of the Facebook page. If anybody buys a lot of our games haven't been played, basically, and they get bought and sold. And some of the older ones, if you have trouble in any way, and you will, downloading or using the disc that came with it, all you need to do is contact me at Marshal. Just go to the Marshal Enterprises site and send me something. I can send you a link to our supplier, which is Flipping Books, and they will provide you with I'll provide you with a link. You can download everything that you need there. You can make PDFs from it and so forth. The other thing that's on our webpage is, for many of the scenarios where I don't do a good job of describing where people are or how they're set up, I tend to put maps. And so be sure and go through and look for your game that you bought. And there may be some scenario maps. There may be some scenario maps there that show you the general orientation of troops and so forth. And it might help you make a little bit more sense out of what I've tried to write.
All right. And William from Kitchener, Ontario, Canada says, are there any regular game get-togethers on the Michigan side of the Detroit River?
Well, I've been looking. I had some people that we did get together, and they would help me play test, but they all moved away. So if that would be something that you would be interested in, I live 1 mile from the Detroit River. If you're familiar with Detroit, I'm on the east side, and I'm in Indian Village, so I'm very close to the tunnel, a little bit away from the older bridge, but I'm very close to the tunnel. So it's not once you get to the river, it's pretty easy. If you have the credentials to get across, then you can. I'm pretty close, and if that's something you might be interested in, I would entertain setting something up to do that.
Yeah, and you can contact Dennis. I think there's probably something on your website, so they could email you or whatnot.
Oh,
yeah, that's the best way to reach you.
Yeah.
So cool. Yeah, because I know William has been following my channel. He's one of our monthly supporters, and so I know he'd be eager to learn from the master, as they say.
Well, did William buy you a coffee?
He did. He's actually,
right.
So I have a monthly membership program, and he's actually part of the old guard. So he contributes every month to that. And then there is, of course, people that buy me a coffee spontaneously, because they hear that I must be getting thirsty from all the talking. So it goes to help support new camera, microphone, all kinds of good stuff.
Right.
We're going to wrap things up here.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank both of you for joining us this evening and sharing your wisdom and experience and your insight into the game and into history. I want to thank my co-host, Brennan, for his contributions and great questions and everything else, as always. The Tactics Talk idea was his, and so it's been a great success. And I think it's brought a lot of folks great information about the game and the period. So thumbs up to everybody for that. And we had one last question here from Texagander. Can someone please spell the cavalry battle that Jim mentioned previously, please?
Well, spelling it, I think the pronunciation is Alta Glofsheim. So ALTE and then GLOFS and then HEIM. I think if you get that, it'll get you close enough where it'll pop up.
All right. I put it in the comment section. So maybe Alta Glossheim. Yeah, that's about
Alta
right.
Glofsheim.
Yeah, that looks about right. So
It's not the name. It's not the name of a ALTE. Okay, you got that Alta, and then Glof is GLOS, Glofsheim. But as the Germans like to do, it's all one word.
right. Okay.
So it's harder to pronounce that way.
Cool. All right. Well, very good. If there isn't anything else, then I think we will leave it on that exciting note. And everybody else, thanks for tuning in. And we will have more stuff here. We've got probably, I'm going to be going to the La Bataille Fest out in Gettysburg here in another week. And so Brennan and I will have some games going on out there. And so I'll be reporting on that as it happens. I'm also going to be at the Consim Expo in Tempe in July. And so I'm helping spearhead and organize all the La Bataille games that we're trying to coordinate out there. So if you are interested in playing La Bataille out at Tempe, get in touch with me and I can get you on the list of players. And if you're in or live within driving distance of Gettysburg and you want to come down and watch or sit in and observe some of the game that's happening, there's probably going to be 3 or 4 La Bataille games happening there at the Days Inn in Gettysburg between March the 3rd and March the 9th. And so you can also then reach me via the channel to get information about that and coordinate a time to visit. That's about it, gentlemen. Thank you all so much. And thank you to all the people that watched.
Thank you, Eric.
All right. And that will wrap things up. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.